Hello and welcome to Please Expand. I'm your host, al-Haytham Rockney, and today I'll be interviewing Seb Falk on his most recent book, The Light Ages. I also have a special guest with me today who will be helping me with the interview, and that is my good friend, the novelist, J.A. Velasco. Welcome on the podcast, Jay.
Thank you very much.
Why don't you tell everyone a bit about yourself?
How long have we got? Hello everyone, I am J.A. Velasco. I'm a novelist, currently working on, as you know, my first novel.
I do know, yeah.
I thank you.
I've been following your work closely.
I thank you very much. And, we met many years ago at the University of Warwick.
That's right. Yeah.
So yes, I'm very happy and very excited to be here. And
how did you find the book? What was your overall impression of The Light Ages?
Look, I mean, you know my position on these medieval people. It takes more than a book to convince me. But I must say that...
Barbarous line.
Yeah, exactly. I thought it was a wonderful book, very thoroughly written. I mean, at parts it was quite complex. I mean, the language was quite heavy at points, but I honestly enjoyed it very much and I learned a lot. The Albion still blew my mind.
Yeah, that was mental.
But yes.
Great. So, as I said, we'll be interviewing Seb Falk on the Light Ages. In the interview, we'll talk about how the Middle Ages weren't that bad, how Christian and Muslim scholars exchange information, the many inventions produced by the Middle Ages, and the thorny question of whether we can call these activities science. As before, there will be a brief post-interview reflection segment where Jay and I will discuss themes raised by the interview in a little more depth. But, without any further ado, I give you Seb Falk.
Get ready.
Hello, welcome to Please Expand. I'm al-Haytham Rockney, and today we're very happy to have with us Dr. Seb Falk, author of The Light Ages. Seb, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Let's just start with the premise of your book, The Light Ages. As we understand your book, what you're trying to do is to shine a light on the so-called Dark Ages. Maybe we could start off by you telling us a bit about why this period has been considered in such a negative light, especially when it comes to assessing its contributions to science.
Yeah. It's, of course, a well-known story that comes out of the Renaissance and the Renaissance attempts to define themselves as rediscovering ancient wisdom, ancient knowledge, the knowledge of Greece and Rome, and in so doing to mark out their period as being an improvement on what had come before. And the Middle Ages becomes called the Middle Ages because it is this period between the classical period and the Renaissance. And that characterization stuck and it got picked up and carried on and developed, and particularly in Protestant countries in Western Europe and in North America after the Reformation. It was used as a stick to beat Catholics with as well, to say that the pre-Reformation medieval Europe, being Catholic, was ignorant and above all, had no understanding of rationalism and of science, and was superstitious. And so these ideas get picked up. But to be honest, often medieval doesn't come from any position of knowledge or even an attempt to denigrate the Middle Ages. It's just simply a kind of lazy characterization that says, well, people in the past must have been stupid. They didn't know anything. They all thought the world was flat. And I went into writing this book for a general audience, wanting to tell people about some of the amazing ideas of the Middle Ages. So wanting to rehabilitate the word medieval to some extent, wanting people to think, well, actually, there's some wonderful things, some fantastic ideas, some great ingenuity and invention that happens in the Middle Ages, but also, importantly, to put science into medieval history, so that if people are interested in the Middle Ages, if people are interested in kings and battles, why shouldn't they also be interested in scientific ideas and technological development of that period as well?
So in your book, we, as you mentioned, we go through many medieval thinkers, and we go from Baghdad to St. Albans, and you claim that they were engaged in scientific activity. What really interests us is the extent to which we can call these activities science. And in a way, it's sort of difficult to read a book about the history of science, in a particular period of time, without thinking of Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And we were wondering, first, what are the criteria by which you judge their activities to be properly scientific? And second, how do you see the arguments in your book in relation to Thomas Kuhn's theoretical framework? Do you think what happened in the Middle Ages was some sort of pre-paradigm science? Was it normal science? What do you make of it?
Yeah, those are interesting questions. I mean, I think, as I've already said, I'm starting from a kind of fairly unambitious position in a way, in that I am not trying to make the claim that what was happening in the Middle Ages was modern science as we would understand it, and I use the word science slightly hesitantly, as I make clear, I think, in my prologue. And there's a slight apology in my acknowledgements to Andrew Cunningham, who taught me here in Cambridge, who was a very strong opponent of the use of the word science for medieval periods. And I thought about this long and hard. And eventually I came down on the side of the argument put forward, I think, quite well by Michael Shank and David Lindbergh in the introduction to their volume 2 of the Cambridge History of Science, where they say that what we are talking about when we talk about medieval science is something that has a family resemblance. That's the phrase they use, a family resemblance to modern science. And so we shouldn't expect to see everything the same. But the point is, really, if we study history of science, and I'm based in a department of history and philosophy of science, if we study history of science, we have to have some kind of understanding in our head of what it is that we're studying. So if I'm allowed to talk about the Middle Ages at all in my department of history and philosophy of science, then I must have some kind of sense that there is some connection, even if we have to caveat it with these really important statements that what people thought they were doing in the Middle Ages when they were looking at the natural world was very different from what scientists think they're doing when they're looking at the natural world today. And so in some ways, yes, Andrew Cunningham is right. It is an entirely different enterprise. And so giving it the same name could be confusing, could be misleading. But I think for the audience that I was writing for, this general audience, I didn't have a problem with that. And I have gradually slipped in my usage. Actually, I used to be very careful never to say medieval science, and at worst to say medieval sciences, and talk about the sciences above all. And then when I teach undergraduates, I say the same thing. Talk about the sciences, talk about astronomy, talk about mathematics, talk about arithmetic. You're on safe ground there. Science, of course, includes theology, if you're using the Latin word scientia in the Middle Ages. And I have slightly slipped. I do now, you will occasionally hear me use the phrase medieval science. But as I say in my book, it is a slightly dangerous term. And I certainly would not use the word scientist, because I think that is too specific. Yes. But to answer your question about Thomas Kuhn, I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that in his terms, what's happening in the Middle Ages is kind of normal science. Right. That these are people who are doing their thing. They are developing ideas, they are refining, they are tweaking, they are making no claims to anything revolutionary. And indeed, it would be antithetical to the kind of principles of medieval sciences, I think, to overturn, to undergo a revolution, because, of course, they saw their work above all as rediscovering and recovering and tweaking and refining the ideas of ancient thinkers, ancient philosophers. And I think actually it fits perfectly well. And of course, Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions was built on his work on Copernicus. So it's hardly surprising, actually, it does fit his paradigm. It does fit his way of thinking quite well. So yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with that characterization of it. But as I say, I think the purpose of my book, above all, is to look less at this long vertical history of science from ancient to modern, and more at this horizontal history of the Middle Ages, and to put science into that history of the Middle Ages.
When you talk about the family resemblances, are you sort of broadly speaking about observing the natural world and drawing conclusions about it? Is that what you're going for?
Yeah, observation of the natural world, try to understand how things work. Of course, there's this classic tension in medieval science between the science of Aristotle, which seeks to answer how and why questions. Why is something the way it is? How does it come to be that way? How do things work? How are things connected? The classic sort of four causes of Aristotle to try to explain how things come to be the way they are. That is a very scientific goal. But of course, the simple characterization that's often made is that modern science mathematizes this. But of course, you do find mathematical science in the Middle Ages as well. And that's where the tension lies between the astronomers who are desperately trying to compute positions, to understand, to predict exactly where things will be at a certain time in a certain place, and perhaps the cosmologers, their cousins, who are trying to understand what things are made of and why they are the way they are. And there is a sort of tension here, and there is a kind of occasional contradiction between the positions taken by people taking different approaches. But basically, the family resemblance is, yes, they're looking at nature, they're trying to understand it. But of course, for Christians in the Middle Ages, and my book, of course, is focused mainly on Western Europe, on Christian Latin Europe, not even barely touching on Byzantium as well. It's an attempt to get inside the mind of God. It's an attempt to understand God through his creation. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. The end results might be the same, that might not affect them, but the goals, the motivations are very important. And these are Christians trying to understand how the miracle of creation is expressed through what they see around them.
Would you say that that's actually one of the many differences between what we call now modern science and what is happening in the Middle Ages? Because I remember, as we were discussing your book, week by week, I will always bring back the point about the precision that wasn't there, because if you were off by a few degrees, we know with the astrolabe, the rest of the tabulation will be wrong. And I always thought about what these people are trying to do is to understand a God who left them in this world without an instructions manual, without a manuscript. Whereas now I feel when scientists do science, they might have religious beliefs, but that all of that sort of subjectivity has to go outside, but because of the idea of the laboratory. And I wonder if there is a sort of individual laboratory in the modern scientists that wasn't in the Middle Age scientists.
Yeah, I mean, I think your basic point is absolutely right. That modern science is not atheistic. It's it is atheistic in the literal sense of being God doesn't enter into it. Yeah. Whether you have a position on God is neither here nor there. Modern science doesn't say there is no God. Modern science says we don't care. And I suppose insofar as modern science has the position on God, it says that God is not interventionist. So if God exists, then God doesn't change the rules of the universe, and certainly not willy-nilly. So yes, of course, that is a different position. That the position of Christian thinkers in the Middle Ages was that God could intervene, even if in practice you had to proceed on the assumption that he's not going to, or if he does, that is seen as exceptional. Right. The whole thing about a miracle is it doesn't happen very often. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called a miracle. So you can kind of discount miracles fairly easily and just say, well, we know God can do that, but we know he chooses not to. But then, of course, there is the sort of logical positioning as well that, that, for example, in the classic cases in the 13th century universities, when the theologians of Paris are arguing with the philosophers of Paris University about questions like the existence of a vacuum or the existence of multiple universes, there is that raises tensions, because the philosophers say, well, logically speaking, you can't really have multiple universes, and the theologians say, well, if God wants to make multiple universes, God can make multiple universes, and they're not really disagreeing, because nobody actually thinks there are multiple universes. It's just a question of whether God could do that if he felt like it on any given day. So there clearly is that difference between medieval and modern science, and yet there is a similarity in the kind of humility, I think, that scientists take, and this I think is a distinction between the public understanding of science today and what most scientists who think deeply about their own discipline would say, is that science is a deeply creative activity. I mean, there's a wonderful book by a colleague of mine called Tom McLeish, The Poetry and Music of Science. I'd highly recommend, all about the creativity in the scientific process. And I think that scientists, when they think deeply about what they're doing, know that their endeavors are not trying to find a set of answers that exists out there that one day they'll get to, and then everybody will say, job done, science is over, we don't need to do any more, we can all go home and do something else now. Science is never going to be over, let's be honest. Science is always going to be pushing at the boundaries of what we know. And in that sense, it does share some similarities, I think, with medieval thinkers who, again, are very modest. They say, we know we can't know everything. We're not as clever as God. God is omniscient. There is literally no way we can possibly understand the mind of God. So all we can do is look at it in an imperfect mirror, or however you want to right. Whatever metaphor you want to use. We want to try and understand as much as we can of our own tiny little perspective and get a glimpse of it. And in a way, there is, I think, a similarity between what modern scientists also are trying to do, knowing that they are just a tiny piece in a puzzle, trying to add their own little piece, but knowing that science is a kind of constantly expanding, constantly developing endeavor.
Yeah, one thing that was constantly surprising us as we were reading your book, and it surprised us especially because, as you said, you're not focused on this vertical narrative of the history of science. You're really just looking at the Middle Ages, and it was how often you gave examples of individuals or ways of thinking that seem to satisfy certain criteria for science that someone like David Wootton gives in his book, The Invention of Science. One of the criteria that Wootton talks about is the invention of the printing press. People talk a lot about the printing press and how it revolutionized how people communicated. But in your book, you talk often about how manuscripts and astronomical tables were copied and transferred across continents, and there seems to be this large net of thinkers whose works would interact. That said, do you think the printing press created a different world before, such that it fostered a new kind of mental sphere that down the line concluded in something in like a different kind of activity to the activity we see in the Middle Ages?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, of course it did, because ultimately it leads to the modern world, and people think differently now from how they thought differently in the Middle Ages. So somewhere, if you want to draw a line, you have to draw a line and say, something has changed. A mental sphere, I mean, it's very hard to talk about how people thought, because people are all individuals and everybody thinks in different ways. I would absolutely agree that the printing press is, an incredibly important agent of change, to use the phrase of Elizabeth Eisenstein, a great historian of this, in terms of affecting how science can proceed and thereby how people think. But of course, it doesn't change overnight, and many of the factors that make the printing press successful and make the printing press an important agent of change in science have to be there beforehand. Otherwise, it couldn't make the difference that it did. So, David Wootton's book is an excellent book. I agree with it in many ways. And of course, he points out at the beginning that astronomy, which is the science that I mainly focus on in my book, was the most kind of modern of sciences before the period that he talks about. So, there are areas in which we disagree, but in general, it's quite hard. I couldn't possibly say that everything that's necessary for modern science is already present in the Middle Ages. That would be ridiculous. But what you do have, I think, is that often people say, well, before the printing press, it was impossible to get hold of texts, or before the printing press, books were unreachably expensive. Before the printing press, nobody could critique other people's work. These are all very sometimes lazy generalizations. Of course, the arguments can be made in more or less subtle ways. But the point is, yes, of course, printing made it easier to get hold of texts. Yes, of course, printing made it easier to produce new editions of texts. It made it easier to draw up accurate diagrams, or not necessarily accurate diagrams, but more intricate and precise and detailed diagrams. Printing, of course, gave the opportunities to people like Copernicus to read lots and lots of different pieces of data and arguments, and it made it possible for ideas to spread widely, across Europe, and of course to bring in and popularize ideas from Byzantium as well at the start of the Renaissance. So printing has an absolutely important impact. But the point that I wanted to make is simply that the conditions for that impact, the desire to recover ancient ideas. The desire to build on them and develop them was absolutely present in the Middle Ages. And without that desire, printing wouldn't have had the success that it did. And yes, of course, texts are harder to come by, but that doesn't mean that they're impossible to come by. And yes, of course, concepts of invention do change, as I believe Wootton argues, but that doesn't mean that there was no idea of invention. And I think I would disagree with him slightly on that point, that, I think that you can see examples of where people do have ideas of invention and innovation in the Middle Ages. And you can see many of those in my book.
Right. Yeah, that was what really interested me, because it's commonly said that before a certain period, everyone thought that everything had already been discovered by the ancients, and that any appearance of a new discovery was really just a re-remembering of what already existed. But that's clearly not the case in a number of things that you discuss in your book. I mean, no one thought that let's say the Albion, for example, had existed in ancient Greece or Rome, right?
Although, it depends on who you ask, right? And the texts are quite difficult to understand, in the sense that there's layers of modesty and literary tropes going on here. So, Richard of Wallingford, writing about his Albion, is incredibly modest about, well, he is and he isn't. In places he's modest, in places he's immodest about his achievements. But the underlying point, I suppose, is that you could say simply that the Albion itself was clearly a new invention, but the Albion is a demonstration or an instantiation of ideas that already existed. So all he's doing, if you want to take the argument that nobody is inventing anything absolutely new, all he's doing is reformatting, is putting ideas that were already there into a new form, or making them newly user-friendly. And indeed, that was the general goal of most astronomy in this period, was this modest goal of making things more user-friendly, making things more accessible. But then, you could say the same about technology today, right? You can make much more money by tweaking an iPhone than by coming up with an entirely new piece of technology. So this kind of idea of tweaking and making incremental improvements is one that we find very much in the Middle Ages. And I think you could put that together with this idea of modesty and say that, yes, people in the Middle Ages mostly didn't, thought that they weren't inventing new things. They were just reaching a better understanding of ideas that were present in ancient thought and known, of course, back at creation in the Garden of Eden before the fall. So, yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, in a way, probably the only sensible answer to this question is to say, well, every individual has a different point of view, so it may not be very helpful to generalize. But absolutely, whatever Richard of Wallingford or his contemporaries might have said about their potential to invent things, they certainly went and did it anyway.
Yeah, so the distinction seems to be between sort of ideas, which are sort of eternal, and the actual devices which help transmit the ideas. And that's what's sort of the new thing for them, the devices.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, so the next question that we have is, I had this idea about, when we think modern science, we think about the tests of experience and experiments. In your book, you mention, you give an example of individuals such as Petrus Alphonsi, a Spanish converso. I was genuinely surprised to see that he urged his contemporaries to abandon outdated texts to learn instead of to learn from experience. I wonder if you could say a bit more how individuals like Petrus Alphonsi understood the idea of learning from practice.
Yeah, it's a big question. The basic premise, I guess, is to understand, if these people go back to Aristotle, who was the kind of touchstone for understanding epistemology, understanding how we can know things at all, there is always the starting point that every knowledge, every piece of knowledge that we have ultimately comes to us through our senses. So there is a kind of a sense that, yes, we do always ultimately learn through observation. We do ultimately learn through experiment. Of course, experiment, and this is where it gets a bit complicated in the Latin, experimentum, means experience, right? It means something that has happened to you, or that you have undergone. And so there's no distinction between experience and experiment, experience being something kind of passive that you have, right, and experiment being something active that you set out to do in a controlled manner. That just doesn't exist in medieval Latin. And so what you see is a kind of development of the ideas of Aristotle in medieval Europe, and indeed in medieval Islam as well. And a key figure in this is Ibn al-Haytham, and the concept of ittibar, which is again a kind of concept of experience, experiment, controlled experience, organized experience. There are kind of layers of this, and you can see the idea developing in Robert Grosseteste, the 13th century scholar, and his commentary on Aristotle, and Roger Bacon picking up the ideas of Robert Grosseteste. So there are lots of different people, and they have lots of different ideas about how to work with experience. But the basic point, I suppose, is that we as individuals only have our own experiences to go by, plus, of course, what we learn from written texts and revelation, indeed, in what is revealed to us by God. So for these people, they have to balance all these different inputs, and they have to try and grapple with the notion of knowledge as being something universal, that I can know something sitting here, that you can also know where you are, and somehow we can both know the same thing, even though we've had limited experience of it from different sides. So this is a very active debate in later medieval Europe, and different people have their own points of view on it. And the really interesting thing, I think, for historians is to try to square these philosophical debates that are being had about, ideas like a universal intellect and these kinds of things that are coming in from people who are commenting on Muslim philosophers like Averroes, squaring these kind of philosophical debates with the practical search for knowledge of someone like Petrus Alphonsi, to give him his Latin name, who is kind of a practical man as well. He is teaching, he is observing, and when you observe the skies, you are making a kind of experiment where you are testing the inherited knowledge, or testing the predictions that have come to you through mathematical tables, or that you have looked at mathematically. You've tried to work out when an eclipse is going to take place using tables, using theories, and then you observe it in the sky and you say, well, is it in the same place? That's clearly an experiment. But it's not, of course, an experiment in the modern sense of being something that is very controlled, that is very repeatable. So you start to kind of get into very hazy notions about modern science, which, it leads you down all kinds of interesting paths.
Right. In fact, one of the beauties of the book, in fact, was for us to discuss how it seems that there was a properly international community of scientists. If
you want scientists,
I wouldn't say that, just to be on the safe side.
That's fine. That's fine.
Actually, sort of exchanging ideas. So there wasn't this, we're not going to read his work because he's from a different religion, because he's Muslim, because he's not Muslim. There seems people seem to intaking and exchanging information, and I think it really speaks of the spirit of knowledge. I wonder though, because obviously when I think of one of the ideas behind David Wotton's conception of scientists is that there is this community of experts that they both collaborate, they also compete. And I got the collaboration from the Middle Ages, but I didn't get the competition. And for some reason, that felt much more enlightening in a way, funny enough. It felt that there wasn't much competition, but rather it was more to do with collaboration more than anything.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question, to what extent people in the Middle Ages saw themselves as collaborating, because one thing they are very keen to do is to cite their authorities and cite their sources. They have an incredible scholarly conscience
Right.
on this, of which any student should be
Yes.
proud and be aspiring to, in terms of always citing your sources. But the question of whether, say, a Christian who is citing the work of a Muslim scholar like al-Batani or al-Kabisi, or a Muslim astronomer whose work is useful to a Christian 50, 100, 200 years later, whether they saw themselves as in a collaboration with that person is kind of open to question. Certainly, absolutely, these Christians have no problem with picking up and using the ideas of Muslim and Jewish and ancient Greek scholars, just as the Muslims, of course, had no problem using the ideas of the Greeks and Christians that were handed down to them.
Right.
The question of whether they see themselves as a collaboration is quite an interesting one, I think, and possibly the point. I mean, I think it's really a question that the medieval Christians don't really consider, that they see the ideas and they want to say where the ideas come from because it's a matter of sort of professional conscience in a way. But the founding principle is one that they've inherited from the church fathers, including, Augustine, which is that no matter where these ideas come from, they can be useful. This concept of Egyptian gold, which is quite a nice metaphor that is popularized in the early medieval period, that pagan ideas are like the gold which the Israelites legitimately stole from Egypt as they were fleeing slavery in Egypt. They took with them the gold of the pharaohs, and they used that gold for their own purposes, and that gold is useful to them, and even though it came from a bad place, is something that they can still legitimately use. And in the same way, the pagan ideas were ideas that could still be legitimately used by Christians, even devout Christians, and even sometimes in the service of theology. So, and Augustine himself and his followers are very clear about this, that of course these pagans, these non-Christians are not authorities on Christianity, but nonetheless their ideas could be useful in the service of theology. So science and theology, of course, are never separate, and indeed in this case too.
Yeah, in the bulk of your book, it mostly just seems to be people are just happy to have these texts handed down to them and to use the information. You give one really amusing example of Roger Bacon savagely criticizing this one French scholar, which was very nice. It shows that nothing has changed in 1,000 years.
Yes.
But just to that point, obviously there must have been criticism between people. Was that a criticism out of a sense of sort of competition, or like an intellectual arms race, who gets the idea first or correctly, or was it something else?
Yeah, I mean, there are some fascinating personalities, and I think all these personalities are different. I think you definitely get a sense of competition, people defending the pride of their order or the pride of their monastery. So, there's an underlying sense that the kind of Franciscans saw themselves as up against the Dominicans, or that, a monk of St. Albans feels that he has to defend the work of Richard of Wallingford because he was a former abbot of St. Albans. So I think there's a kind of sense of they're defending the pride in the same way that, you wouldn't, if you support a football team today, you might bemoan the poor performance of your own football team last night, whoever, they just got beaten. But if somebody from a supporter of an opposing team, you're a Liverpool fan, Liverpool got beaten, and then some Evertonian comes along and says, look, Liverpool are awful, you're going to defend your team, even if 5 minutes ago you were just slating them. So I think there's always this kind of sense of pride and this sense of loyalty. And yes, individual pride too, but that is, a mortal sin, right? Pride is something that Christians should avoid. And so, of course, it exists, but very few people are going to admit to it. And I think the sense of kind of loyalty to the ideas comes out more. And of course, yes, competition. But given the kinds of texts that we're dealing with and the kinds of texts that survive, these sort of personal things are pretty rare. And Roger Bacon is quite unusual in putting these things down, and that we're lucky that they've survived. And, his writings survive at great length in a way that they don't for others. But generally speaking, you kind of look at the manuscripts of scientific treatises and textbooks and you think, well, where would I find this? There's just not an opportunity for these things to crop up, and they kind of show up in odd places. But generally speaking, I think we have an evidential problem there as well. So, I think some of that personality gets a bit lost, and we have to grab hold of it when we find it. But if humans are humans, they're jealous, they're proud, just in the past, just as they are today.
And it should also, I suppose, go back to kind of a theological principle of, if we're using science, if we are doing these tabulations and we're using all these instruments to try to understand the way God made the world, which God are we talking about? Is it the one that they believe? Is it the one that I believe as a Christian? Is it the one that Muslim? Which one is it? And that surely must have...
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it is a really interesting question, and it's a parallel question, I think, to the one that I alluded to earlier about astronomy and cosmology, right? That you, on the one hand, you think, well, these must have been at the back of people's minds, right? When you have these debates, you think, surely I should consider what the kind of foundational beliefs of this person were. Just as, when you're measuring the position of Mars in the sky, should you be thinking about what Mars is made of and whether those epicycle and deferent, which work very well as a geometrical model, whether they really exist in reality or whether the reality is somehow different. And if they do exist in reality, how the orbs intersect and how much space they take up, and these kind of big cosmological questions, which aren't necessary to a correct calculation of the position of Mars. And I think there's an analogy there, which basically is probably at some level people think about these questions and they worry about them perhaps occasionally, but when it comes down to the practical day-to-day of what they need to achieve, they think, well, this works, I'll park it, I'll pigeonhole it, I'll think about it later. And I think that probably is how most people thought about it. Right. That maybe occasionally they worried about it, but as long as it was useful to them, it kept sliding and sliding until another day.
Yeah, I mean, it just I really want to reinstate this. It was really impressive that during the Reconquistas, like Spain, that Castile would take back land, and then people in that land who had just been reconquered would contribute to the development of thought in another country in Europe. I mean, people have to get on. I mean, I think the whole kind of, and you may know more about this than I do. But I think the idea of kind of Reconquista is, slightly problematic in a sense of being, implying that it belonged to the Christians in the first place, and they're reconquering it. Sure. It is something you kind of have to say, well, put yourself in the mindset of the people there. Most of those people, they had never known anything other than the people that were ruling their territory, and maybe half the time they weren't even aware who was ruling their territory, because you look at a modern map and it gives you this impression that there's a very clear borderline drawn, and actually things are a lot more fuzzy and indistinct in reality. So I think you see this as well with the Ismailis and the Mongols when I'm talking in the final chapter about Tusi and the observatory at Maraga in what is now Iran, where fundamentally you've got an astronomer who wants to do his astronomy. He just wants to get on. He just wants to look at the sky. He wants people to leave him alone. And there's an element of just let me get on with this. And then, of course, the Christians that come over to southern Spain or central Spain in the 12th century, who are desperate for the knowledge that they've heard exists there. People like Gerard of Cremona, who comes over from Italy. He's heard that he can get hold of the Almagest. He's heard of the Almagest. He's desperate to do this to the extent that he teaches himself Arabic in order to understand the Almagest in Arabic. Now, I've read the Almagest. It is a bloody difficult text, even in English. So the idea that Gerard of Cremona, being a Latinate Italian, can go over and understand and translate the Almagest in Arabic, which of course has been translated from the original Greek, just blows my mind. Yeah. But these people, they're interested in the knowledge. They're interested in what they can get their hands on. They're not so worried about who's ruling which bit of territory. And I suppose if you asked Gerard of Cremona, he'd be pleased that it was a Christian rather than a Muslim. But fundamentally, he probably doesn't. It doesn't make that much difference to him. And the people that he's talking to are interested in collaboration, interested in. I mean, I think that's the most fascinating part of it. Actually, is remembering that someone like Gerard of Cremona and the other translators, when they go to somewhere like Spain, they're not just getting hold of manuscripts, copying and translating them, working from
parchment with ink, they're also talking to individuals. They are conversing, they're learning, they are receiving instruction on instruments. So there's a real kind of conversation that's going on here. And that's, I think, where you see the real collaboration take place that we were talking about.
Right.
Wonderful. So just final question. Just to wrap things up. Looking towards the future, is there another, well, maybe not the future, but is there another period of history that you think has been particularly prejudiced, like the Middle Ages, and that deserves of light?
Yeah, I mean, I think well, the Middle Ages was kind of my first love, and I was always a bit kind of confused as to why nobody ever talked about the ideas or the science of the Middle Ages. And of course, people had, but we always, for every new generation, we have to kind of make that argument again. I'd love to expand some of this and to talk in more detail about what's happening in other parts of the world, because although, I do talk about different parts of the world in my book, it is mainly focused on Europe. And I'd love to, make comparisons, deeper comparisons with what's happening in China, what's happening, perhaps even in the Americas. There's that. There's so much fascinating history out there. I finished writing this book. I want to go and read everybody else's books now and learn what they've got to say. And I'll think about writing another book myself when I've got caught up with all the history that I've missed while I've been writing it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed our interview with Seb Falk. This is the post-interview reflection segment where Jay and I will discuss some of the things from the interview that we thought deserved more attention.
Discussion of a discussion.
Exactly.
Or a meta-discussion, as I like to call it, yes.
So, Jay, before we get started,
yes,
what is your overall impression of the book?
My overall impression of the book is, rather positive. It was a very interesting read. I think, overall, there has never been a better time to be a sort of non-fiction writer. And I accepted your invitation to this podcast because I was compelled to inquire about, how someone could write a book about science at the time, when the systematic enterprise of science as we know it today didn't exist. To me.
Okay. So
no, it was an interesting book, but
exactly.
Obviously, it would be like making a book about medicine in pre-Columbian periods.
Right. Okay. Good. So let me stop you there because
Yes.
you've already touched on a pretty thorny issue of the book.
Yes.
So first of all, do you think the medieval scholars that Seb describes were doing science as like modern science?
You're throwing me here to the crucifying me, nailing me to the cross. I would say they were not doing science not as we know it today.
Yeah. Okay. And I also don't think so, but Seb clearly thinks otherwise.
Yeah.
For Seb, we can say that they were doing science because what they were doing looks like science.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Sure. It looked like science, of course. I don't know. I don't know. You are the philosopher here. How can something look like something that didn't exist prior to the concept?
Yes. Yeah. I know all the answers.
What is the meaning of meaning?
It's an interesting question. So, if we think that science is looking at the world around us and drawing conclusions about it, then I suppose we might think that what they were doing in the Middle Ages was science.
Yes.
But I'm not very satisfied with that because that description can explain all kinds of activities and theories that are clearly not science.
I agree with you. It can become sort of a broad concept like that because, look, I guess the issue here is if today someone said to me alchemists were scientists, I can categorically label that statement as false, knowing what I know now. However, by Seb's sort of logic, I can't prove the sentence false because for alchemists in the Middle Ages, what they were doing also kind of looked like science.
Yeah.
And therefore, they are scientists.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the issue when you have such a broad concept. But I think we're being a little unfair to Seb because he also said that we shouldn't expect science in the Middle Ages to be just like modern science.
Correct.
In the book, in the introduction to the book, actually, he gives the example of war and war studies. War in the Middle Ages was obviously different to how war is nowadays. And yet, we still speak of a single concept of war. And this is a cool point. Why is it that we can talk about war in both the Middle Ages and the modern era, but we might not be able to do the same with science?
I see what you mean. Okay, my inclination to think of this is, I think war is, simply the means by which two entities carry conflict in the pursuit of establishing the winner's ideological position as a de facto, unchallenged status quo. That's what I think it would be, like, my definition of war. You can apply this definition, to bows and arrows, to a tank, to a nuclear warhead, etc. But with science, I'm not very sure you can.
So, yeah, I think what makes this question so interesting is that it engages two different ideas of concepts. On the one hand, concepts, in this case science, it's the same concept throughout history. And we explain the differences in science by saying that the concept develops over time.
Right.
On the other hand, we might say that there are actually different concepts and that they're connected with other concepts, but they're not the same as them. So to take Seb's point, it's obviously the case that modern science doesn't just come out of nowhere. It is clearly indebted to a lot of the work that was done before it in the Middle Ages. Right? And Seb wants to explain this connection by saying that both activities are science.
It's interesting. I was thinking about this the other day, actually. A friend of mine asked me, when does one become a writer? Is it, when a person writes the first sentence of the first, ever story you've written or something? Or is it when you finish the book and the book is, you can pick up the book from the shelf at your local bookshop? Likewise, I thought about it with baking. When does the baker become a baker? When he mixes, flour and water for the first time to make his starter, when he opens a bakery and you can, buy the loaf from the baker. Where do you get this bread from the bakery? And who owns the bakery? The baker. So the question then would be, when can we call someone a scientist?
Yeah. Okay, so let's stick with the writer example. So the issue seems to be focused on whether you have to be published or not to be a writer.
Yeah.
But that presupposes an entire social practice of publishing and being an author, sort of scare quotes. So we might make a distinction between being a writer and being an author. When you write your first sentence, you're a writer. But when you get published, you're an author. And this example is interesting because someone might make the same distinction between people doing science in the Middle Ages and modern scientists.
Right.
Both of them are doing science, as Seb would say, but it is only in the 19th century that the social institution of being a scientist is born.
Okay.
But we want to know whether they're doing science, right?
Yeah.
So if we return to your example, the question would be, is a writer doing the same thing as an author? Is someone in the Middle Ages doing the same thing as a scientist?
Yes, I you have something pretty good here. I think the answer to your question partly would be yes. Both writer and author do one thing, they write, and that is sort of the common denominator here. The author, however, also engages in other activities regarding his authorness, not authorship, but authorness, like going on public talks, signing books, promoting other work, and so on and so on. And just, I would like to think, in a similar way, a post-19th century scientist engages with other activities of, science, like modern science, like, peer reviewing, publishing papers, giving lectures at university, getting grants, and so on and so on.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a really good point, because there's a whole social dimension to being an author that is not part of being a writer.
Yeah.
And we could say the same thing about being a scientist, or about someone who does science. You've already mentioned a pretty important aspect of modern science, peer reviewing.
Yes.
So that is a process whereby scientists read each other's work to confirm or critique experimental results. Did that exist in the Middle Ages? I'm not sure. Seb was pretty hesitant to describe their behavior as collaborative, or at least collaborative in the way that we would understand peer review.
Yeah, I agree. I suppose, there are all the conditions of both science and doing science that require exploration to, fully answer the question. I mean, logically, however, what you said does make sense.
Thank you. And
You should, yeah, I wish your listeners could see that face you just went there.
thank you for your kind words. Okay, so yeah, I think we've exhausted this topic.
Yes.
We haven't really answered it, but yeah. I mean, yeah, we're not entirely sure that they were.
Yeah, I
doing
mean,
science.
and
There are some doubts.
I suppose, your podcast isn't really about ultimate truth. Well,
No.
it should be.
Ultimately, it is.
Ultimately,
but
it
it's
is.
not delivering right.
You lay the law of the land
Exactly.
in this auditive space.
So
Yes.
okay, so we might say something about the idea behind the book. So Seb wants to
Yeah,
rehabilitate the Middle
I
Ages.
have some feelings about this.
Okay.
I have feelings towards this thing.
Let's hear them.
Yes, thank you. Hear me out. So, I just read Catherine Harvey's fantastic book, The Fires of Lost Sex in the Middle Ages. It's published now, hardback as well. Self-explanatory plot, obviously, sex in the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. It's
It's a great topic.
it's a great topic. Now, both books, The Light Ages and Fires of Lost, begin with this plea, or I don't know. At times it sort of feels like an exhortation of sorts about. I don't know. I don't want to be mean, but it's like, please don't be mean to the Middle Ages, and they were nice, and they were not this squalor place that you think about. And there are also a few examples of the of the usage of the word medieval in its pejorative sense, I suppose.
Yeah. So there's the famous example of David Cameron speaking to Parliament, where he describes the violent activities of the Islamic State in Syria as medieval.
Yeah, correct. In fact, the book of Fires of Lost does begin with that quotation as well.
Okay.
And Seb Falk also touched this topic during the interview, and I understand exactly what they're doing, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't do it. I do think, however, that if you go and ask people in the street, random, what they think, if they think the Middle Ages weren't a great time to be alive, probably 9 out of 10 would say yes. It was, I don't know, and when they say this, when they say the Middle Ages were not a great time, they don't mean that they were, I don't know, they couldn't do science or anything. They're not thinking about these things. They're not thinking about the scientific capabilities, processes, aims, methods, whatever. What people are thinking is the social and political context, the day-to-day life of these individuals, really.
Yeah, I suspect that's right. When we think of the Middle Ages, we think of knights, castles, muddy battles, crusades.
Yeah, all these films, all the,
Yeah, no one's doing a film about a monk in a cloister.
Not yet. It would be a great film. I mean,
It could be a great film.
Jude Law would be a wonderful John Westwick. And
interesting shout.
yeah, I know. Thank you. You heard it here first. But what people really think of, honestly, is lack of hygiene, no antibiotics, no affordable steaks, or whatever vegan equivalent there is. They think of, I don't know, no budget airline, beheadings in the public square, witch hunts, and so on. I do think it's quite a trend now that, on the one hand, write books about the Middle Age that begin by asking its readers to, think of it in kinder terms, yet when you actually read aspects of it, it's nearly impossible not to laugh. And I think it kind of happens throughout any single period of history. Soon, someone's going to write a book about barbarians, and they're going to say the same, please don't be mean, don't use the word barbaric. I mean, and honestly, if you ask Greta Thunberg if 2021 was a good year to be alive, she would have said, no, it was horrible. But if you ask Steven Pinker, he would say, oh no, things have never been better.
Best time.
Exactly. And I think that's just something, I mean, by all means, write these books. But in my personal opinion, I'm kind of sick of being told that, oh, please don't be mean to Middle Ages, because there is nothing solid. Things are A and B. And I actually have a few examples, if I may.
I think you have to, after this devastating critique, to a whole area.
Corpus of
historical non-fiction.
Look, this is from Fires of Lost. And again, I love the book. I've probably told you about this before.
You have.
And I haven't read you the quote. So the book begins with the same thing, please be nice to the Middle Ages. And a few pages down the line, literally, I have the following. Quote, according to Albertus Magnus, the male penis is a sort of perfected and complete thing which moves to the exterior, whereas the womb, along with the parts associated with it, it's a sort of incomplete and imperfect thing that is restrained internally. So, and then here the writer is kind enough to explain what this means in case you missed it. It was theoretically possible for a woman to turn into a man if she overheated, forcing her internal organs out of the body.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
That's some strong anatomy knowledge there.
Come on, I mean...
Yeah, okay, so people in the Middle Ages may have been really good at precisely measuring the position of a star.
Some very privileged people, yeah.
But they didn't have the most sophisticated knowledge about other things.
Anatomy in particular.
Okay, but I have to try and save Seb's book here.
Yeah, no, I'm not... Yeah, carry on.
Right, so I think you're absolutely right about how people think about the Middle Ages. And I think you're also right that it probably wouldn't be a good time to be alive. But, isn't it good to have books by Seb who sort of say there are some good things
I
as well?
actually have another quote here involving a recipe to grow a woman's breasts. So you're gonna love this. It involves blood from the testicles of a castrated pig.
Okay, and I think that's all we have time for today.
No, I agree.
You've done a great job advertising Catherine Harvey's book, though. We should have interviewed her as well.
This is where I stop receiving an invitation for future episodes. Just for the record, I love both books. Especially Seb Falk's book. It was one.
My lawyer is looking at me right now. And I'd like to note that the views expressed by Jay are entirely his own and not representative of Please Expand.
No one is ever going to hurt me. It's probably my publishers when they're being like, oh, why would you do that?
No. I'm sure we'll be seeing you around again.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to all our listeners for sticking with us this far. Please make sure to subscribe and rate the podcast. You can find all information on upcoming interviews and ways to get involved at the website www.pleaseexpand.com. And follow me on Twitter @PleaseExpand with just one E between the words. My next interview will be with Professor David Wootton on his much acclaimed book, The Invention of Science.
That's a wonderful book, man.
It is a wonderful book, isn't it? Where we will talk about whether science can be said to have been invented at a specific point in history and what the necessary conditions of the invention are. So quite topical, given
I know, it is, yes.
Jay, thank you once more for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
That's all from us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.